Thanks for listening to the Red Treehouse, where I tell scary stories to keep you up at night. You can listen to the Red Treehouse on your favorite streaming platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Oh, and leave a 5-star review. You can follow the Red Treehouse on social media, on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, X, Threads, and Facebook at Red Treehouse Pod. And now you can find the Red Treehouse on Patreon. Join the Red Treehouse community for as little as $3 per month and receive exclusive member benefits. Simply go to patreon.com/Red Treehouse. As always, if you have a scary story or topic you'd like me to feature on an upcoming episode, email redtreehousepod@gmail.com. Important note: sources for this episode can be found in the show notes. The Red Treehouse is dedicated to my dad. I love you, Pop. Did you know, of all the stories and topics we've covered on the Red Treehouse, my absolute favorites are the listener stories. I'm always honored when a listener sends in a spooky experience, and I'm always excited to narrate these scary stories to keep you up at night. Recently, I connected with an author, C.A. Serna, who sent an original short story for me to read on the show. I'm thrilled to share this one with you. In this episode of The Red Treehouse, we're going to explore a terrific horror fiction story, A Therapy Session, written by C.A. Serna. I'll read this story in 2 episodes, part 1 now, and part 2 next week. So sit back, pull up the covers, and pay close attention as I read A Therapy Session. I'm your host, Will. Welcome to the Red Treehouse. A Therapy Session, Part 1. Clyde was only 12 years old when his brother Mason died in a car accident. It happened on a bitter cold day in Nebraska. Clyde was suffering in bed, fighting the nastiest cold of his life. It wasn't his favorite way to spend the week of winter break, but it was still better than dealing with old Mrs. Rosenberg and her bad breath. As he reached for another tissue to clear his nose, he looked out his window. The view perfectly captured the tall, leafless redbud trees within the frame. It reminded him of a painting his mom would create. As he tossed his tissue out, little white specks began to gently flutter outside. "Snow," he exclaimed to himself. "Fuck, is it snowing again?" Mason uttered, standing outside his younger brother's room. He had just turned 16 and finally had access to the family minivan, a perk that he'd been happily abusing. "Mason," Clyde said, full of congestion, "are you going somewhere?" "Yeah, so what? I'm going over to Eddie's." "But Mason, Mom said," "I know what she said, it's fine. It's barely snowing right now. Plus, I'll be back before Mom and Dad get home." "Promise?" Clyde's voice was serious. His face was intense, his stare unrelenting. Clyde wasn't like the other kids his age. His imagination was growing at an accelerated rate. But instead of spending his time in the clouds, he obsessed over fear. Dark, intrusive thoughts corrupted his mind the way venom could eat away flesh. Poor young Clyde didn't even know the word anxiety. He couldn't explain it, not even to his own mother, and he tried. All he knew was how it felt, how it boiled his blood, churned his stomach, and twisted his imagination. To him, it was only known as the bad feeling. Mason looked at his brother's face and felt sympathy. He hadn't had a soft spot for his brother since maybe the day he was born. He felt like something was wrong, like his brother was trying to tell him something. A warning, maybe. He looked at Clyde's frightened eyes and said, "All right, Clyde, I promise." There was shock on Clyde's face when he heard his name. He tried to think of a time when Mason had said it before, but he couldn't. Clyde got a lot of nicknames over the years, mostly bad words, but he never heard his brother call him Clyde. For a quick second, it truly felt like he had a brother. He watched Mason pull out of their driveway from his window, then felt a shiver. That was the last time he'd see his brother. The next thing Clyde remembered was being woken up by his mother. She looked absolutely hysterical, with panic in her eyes and wavering in her voice. "Clyde, do you know where Mason is?" Clyde didn't respond. "Baby, please, I need you to tell me where Mason is." Clyde still didn't respond. A combination of his cold, the grogginess from waking up, and the cough syrup he'd taken earlier made him as useless as a glass of water given to a man who had already died of thirst. His mother was losing her nerve. "Damn it, Clyde, say something." She stopped. Her hand covered her mouth. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to swear." "Clyde, please, for the love of God, if you know anything, tell me. No one is in trouble, okay? I just want to know where Mason is." This brave woman was still trying to hold it together, knowing damn well her oldest son could be hurt or even dead. Right on cue, the bad feeling inched slowly up his spine, spreading throughout his body. Clyde was scared all right, but his mother was terrified. "For God's sake, Clyde, will you fucking answer me?" Her voice rose. Her patience was gone. Her panic finally broke through. That's when tears began to fill her eyes. Clyde finally spat out, "Eddie's." He said he was going to Eddie's. In a blink, Clyde's mother had already left the room and was heading down the stairs. He could hear her scream to his father to hurry and grab the keys. But before Clyde could hear them open the front door, a luminescent flood of blue and red grew brighter until his room was completely lit up. That's when the silhouettes of large patches of snow were made visible during that dark winter night. Each flake, hastily ready to join others like it, piled firmly on the ground at least a foot high. "Please come home, Mason. Come home," his thoughts whispered. He sprang from his bed to the window and looked out. Clyde already knew. He always knew. He only had thought of this scenario 100 times or more after Mason drove off. He knew when the snow didn't stop falling. He knew when his mother woke him in a panic, yelling and crying. He looked out that window, only to confirm the nightmare he crafted in his head. His mother wailed a harrowing scream throughout the house. The longer she screamed, the deeper the bad feeling injected itself into Clyde's psyche. He knew to call his parents if Mason ever tried to leave when they weren't home, especially when it snowed. But Clyde didn't know about the incoming blizzard hitting the Midwest. He should have called his parents right away, even if it meant Mason would kick his ass. Then maybe, just maybe, Mason would still be here. Snapping awake from the weirdest daydream, Clyde, about 20 years older now, and going by Dr. Clyde Miller, suddenly returned to his office where he was sitting at his desk, confused where the distraction had come from. He had been reviewing some notes he'd written from a therapy session he had with Madeline, one of his patients. It was something he'd read that started it all. Just 2 words that he didn't even remember writing. Come home. Wow, I think I need a vacation, he said to himself. Dr. Miller had been a psychotherapist for the last few years, and had finally just started his own private practice. He even turned his garage into an office. He loved his job, but exhaustion was starting to take its toll on the young doctor. He'd been burning the candle at both ends, hence the daydreaming. But he didn't mind one bit. Clyde was a fantastic therapist. At least he thought so. And he would go through a great deal for his patients. He sat back up in his chair. Why was I thinking about Mason? It had been some time since he thought of his deceased brother. It took many years of therapy before Clyde's grief healed. He learned while in therapy just how powerful the mind was. His fascination with mental health turned him to psychology in college, but his compassion for others pushed him to be a therapist. Clyde wanted to help people, just like how someone helped him in his darkest hour. And that's why he became a psychotherapist. All of a sudden, the phone on his left started to ring. The first ring had him shooting out of his seat. Embarrassed about his overreaction, he composed himself, then picked up the phone. Dr. Miller? Nothing. Just the numbing buzz of an empty line ringing in his ear. The call dropped on the last ring. Dr. Miller put the phone down and thought, well, that was strange. Then the phone rang again. This time he answered before the first ring finished. He picked it up and repeated his usual greeting. But still nothing. He felt nervous. Something about this felt off. There's something a little haunting about answering a phone and finding there's no one there. The silence almost as loud as the thoughts themselves. That droning, abysmal silence. Why can't someone just turn it off? Help me. The call dropped. That was enough for Dr. Miller. He immediately redialed the last caller. It was their tone. It sounded afraid. Clyde wasn't sure. He felt like this person needed him. But still, there was something eating at him. It was invasive, trying to find a crack anywhere to seep into his mind. It felt like the ringing finally stopped. On the other line, a strong masculine voice, much different than the one Clyde had just heard, or thought he heard, spoke. Hello? Clyde lost his words and trailed off. He didn't know what he was expecting, but this wasn't it. His brain was firing neurons like pistons, but still he said nothing. Hello? The voice's patience was receding. Yes, sorry about that, he cleared his throat. My name is Dr. Clyde Miller. I believe someone from this number tried to reach me. The voice didn't respond. I'm a therapist, so I was just wondering if someone was... I know who you are. The voice dryly spoke, cutting off the doctor. Taken aback, Miller fumbled his words before spitting out. Oh, were you the one who called then? I did. I see. Well, how can I help you? Were you wanting to make an appointment? Clyde noticed his hand turned cold as he held the phone. There was a pause, before the voice spoke again. "Do you do house visits?" "I do, but I will let you know up front. I do charge a little bit more than if you were to come to my office. Is that all right?" "Sure, Doc." Spoken like a bone buried in the desert. He wasn't very fond of the nickname, but only said, "Well, let me check my calendar quick. I can get you in a week, at 2 p.m. Will that work?" "Tomorrow," was the only response given. "Tomorrow?" he said with surprise. "I'm sorry, but I can't book you for tomorrow. There's some paperwork that needs to be filled out. Insurance information. I don't need it. I'll pay in cash. Just need one therapy session." "One?" "That's right, one." Now it was Clyde's turn to remain quiet. The voice started again. "It has to be tomorrow. If you can't, then let's forget the whole thing." There it was again, the fear he heard in the voice. Dr. Miller recognized it the moment the voice finished. The doctor thought about his words for a moment before saying, "Okay, I'll make an exception. If you only need one session, we can skip all the paperwork, and you don't even have to pay me." He was stopped again. "You're getting paid, Doc. I don't accept charity, and I don't need your pity." The cold words were felt through the phone. "Well, okay," the doctor said, trying to sound encouraging. "Let me get your information then." The rest was nothing but business, and as the conversation finished, there was a sigh of relief released from the doctor's lungs. He thought to himself, was that weird or what? It was 8:30 a.m. on the dot when Dr. Miller arrived at the Hansen residence. It was a beautiful home, but matched the exact personality of the other houses on the street. Beautiful bloomed rose bushes guided up the stairs to a great big oak door that marked the threshold of this mighty abode. Dr. Miller knocked as the sun finally warmed up, beaming a gentle light onto the deck. It radiated on the doctor's face as he let out a sigh. It's another beautiful morning here in Nebraska. It was now 5 minutes past 8:30 a.m., and still no one had answered the door. He tried the doorbell this time, despite his rule of never ringing a doorbell before 10 a.m. The doorbell seemed to have done the trick. He could hear rustling past the oak door. The door creaked a bit, and suddenly he saw the face of a man through the window pane. The sight startled him so much, he jumped back in fright. The door opened slowly, and out stepped a disheveled-looking man with bags under his eyes. A sign of poor sleep habits, the doctor thought to himself, starting his diagnosis. The stubble on his beard was way beyond the typical 5 o'clock shadow, as it looked unkempt and dirty. Dr. Miller had to breathe through his mouth to avoid the ripe, pungent smell that seeped from the house and off his patient. The clothes Mr. Hansen had on were covered in stains and had wrinkles all along his body. His jacket appeared to be the only clean thing he was wearing. Wafting a hot and presumably horrid breath, Mr. Richie Hansen skittishly said, "Dr. Miller?" "Yes, hi. Mr. Hansen, I presume. Good morning, it's so good to meet you." The doctor spoke with respect and a smile. "Please, call me Richie, Doc." Dr. Miller's face slightly cringed at the nickname. "Understood. May I come in?" If you had asked Dr. Miller 10 minutes ago if he was excited about seeing the home, his answer honestly would have been yes. He lived in the older part of town, so getting to step into these newer homes was like being at an open house without the guilt of making an offer. But when he entered the Hansen home, he hid a face of disgust. It was like a tornado had run through the entire place, destroying and throwing everything in its path. The walls were covered in holes and scratches. All the furniture was flipped over. With each step he took, the doctor felt some sort of debris that covered the entire floor. Entering from the front door, a small hallway led to the living room area, or what looked like it should have been the living room. To the left was a dining room with stairs leading to the top floor. Dr. Miller noticed the guardrails were shattered, overlooking the drop-off from the second floor to the kitchen. Richie flipped over a small, rounded ottoman and moved the only piece of furniture that wasn't turned over, a nice-looking recliner. "Here you go, Doc. You can have the big chair," he said, patting it on the back. "Actually, Richie, if you don't mind, I'd like for you to sit there. I'll take the ottoman," Dr. Miller said, keeping his philosophy to always comfort the patient. "As you wish, Doc." Richie flopped onto the recliner. When he finally got comfortable, he pulled a flask out of his jacket pocket and took a large swig of whatever was in it. He wiped his mouth and looked at the doctor, embarrassed. "Oh, excuse me. I'm being a terrible host. Would you like some?" The slur in his speech told his therapist more than he probably could have intended. Dr. Miller's face must have looked disapproving, because the second he asked the question, Richie pulled the flask away. Shame was written on his face. "Mr. Hansen, it's not even 9 o'clock yet." "No, I know, I'm sorry." The mask that Richie was wearing had fallen off. The facade of a straight shooter was gone. Sitting in front of Dr. Miller was a broken man, a man who had lost everything about himself, a man who needed his help. "Hey," Dr. Miller spoke softly in hopes of showing sympathy. "I know things are hard. You didn't even have to tell me, but I can already tell things are hard right now. I'm not here to judge. I'm here to listen." He swore he heard Richie begin to sniffle. "Doc, I'm not okay. I'm not okay at all." As Richie finished his statement, he began to weep. His hands covered his face to hide the agony. "I'm not okay." He placed the flask back to his lips and took another drink. The doctor allowed his patient to cry before continuing. He learned a long time ago that it was best to let them cry it out. It was just easier to have a conversation that way. When Richie composed himself, Dr. Miller said, "Well, Richie, I want you to know that I am here for you. And if you don't mind, I would like to begin our session." The doctor pulled out a small recording device, clicked the button, then continued. "I want to give you enough time to talk to me, to get the most you can from this session. So please tell me, what made you call me yesterday for this session?" His voice changed from professional to friendly. And then, Richie, slightly buzzed at only 9 a.m., cold-faced and without a grip of hesitation, looked at the doctor, then asked as serious as a judge, "Do you believe in ghosts, Doc?" The doctor smiled at his patient, thinking it was the beginning of a joke. But Richie's face never changed. A punchline never came. No laughter was heard. Still smiling, he asked, "I'm sorry, I'm not sure what you mean. I didn't used to believe in them either. If you asked me that question a year ago, I would have laughed your ass right out the door. But now," he paused to sip from his flask. Dr. Miller's smile disappeared. He suddenly felt afraid. He might have just walked into the home of a seriously mentally unstable man. He continued cautiously, "Talk to me, Richie. What's going on?" Richie drank from the flask again, shuddered in his chair, and said, "There's some real dark history here in Nebraska, Doc. Did you know there was a group of Satanists that settled around these parts back in the late 1800s? The doctor felt his heartbeat increase. His forehead started to tingle with sweat. Carefully choosing his next words, he said, "I wasn't aware of that kind of history." There was a long silence. Dr. Miller took his chance and asked, "How does this relate to why you wanted a therapy session? What about the locust plague of 1874? Have you heard of that?" Losing patience, Dr. Miller said, "Richie, I'm sorry, but have you or have you not?" Richie's voice screamed from the top of his lungs, completely overpowering the calm tone of his therapist. "All right," the doctor sat up. "I've had enough of this. I'm sorry, Richie, but I think we need to have a real appointment at my office where I can properly diagnose you. I'm looking around and I'm worried about you. I have half a mind to call the nearest inpatient facility to get you checked because..." The doctor was cut off for the last time, this time by the sound of Richie standing up from his recliner and his gun's metallic hammer pulling back. Richie was holding a shiny, short-nosed revolver, and it was pointed right at Dr. Miller, freezing his blood while he stared right down the barrel. The doctor, now trembling, moved his hands up, pleading, "Please, don't do this." Richie was breathing harder now. That's when Dr. Miller noticed the gun was wavering. He thought, he's scared too. With a breathy tone, Richie said, "Look, Doc, I don't want to hurt you. I don't. But I need someone to listen to me. I need someone to hear what I have to say. And I know what I'm about to tell you is going to be hard to believe, but it's the fucking truth." Dr. Clyde Miller turned pale, and with panic in his eyes, fear present in his tone, he said, "I'll listen to whatever you want to say." "Thank you." Richie lowered the gun, but didn't put it away. He continued to hold it as he sat back in the recliner and repeated his question. "Have you heard of the locust plague of 1874? Dr. Miller shook his head no. "Well, allow me to give you a history lesson, Doc. During late July of 1874, swarms of locusts completely decimated the agriculture of the Midwest, including Nebraska. You can read all about it. There's writing about a dark cloud overshadowing the sun. Then, all of a sudden, everything was getting infested with these bugs. Homes, farms, you name it. Whatever the grasshoppers got their hands on, they destroyed. Well, you see, everyone back in the late 1800s were basically all Christian. A lot of people looked at this as a bad omen. There were even sermons comparing the locust plague to one of the 10 great plagues of Egypt. You know, from the book of Exodus. God had cursed them, and it was happening right in front of their eyes. Like most people in a time of crisis, they turned to religion. So naturally, a lot of people begged God for forgiveness for whatever sins they made to cause the plague. But there were others who didn't think they should have been begging God for mercy. They turned their hearts to God's favored fallen angel, Satan. These devil worshippers begged, prayed, and even killed for Satan to save them. And you know what? These Satanists lived better than anyone else around the area. A hatred began to grow for these Satanists. Maybe it was jealousy, maybe religious zeal. But whatever it was, they united and exiled those Satan worshippers from their homes. They literally took nothing but the clothes on their backs. Everything else was burned to help purge the area. Well, the rumor was, these Satanists eventually found themselves some unclaimed land in southeast Nebraska. They created a small community. Some called it a cult. But it was just a way of living. It was their religion. They even gave themselves a name, the Diaboli Locustarum, which roughly translates to the devil's locusts, in Latin, by the way. So while these Satanists started their new lives, they also spent a lot of time and energy growing and plotting for revenge. All that hatred that festered among them for years grew and grew stronger, just so they could bring something evil to this world. They conjured a deity, something with powers beyond man and full of the hatred of all 7 circles of hell. They opened a portal, and a demon came to Nebraska. Reports say a total of 142 people died during the massacre. But everyone that died that night, they all died the exact same way. Their eyes and hearts were ripped right out of their bodies. They never found a single set of eyes or one of the missing hearts, at least none that were documented. The Diaboli Locustarum claimed these kills and credited their demon for the slaughter. So of course, the Christians got pissed off and outrage occurred. The only way to respond to violence is more violence. It was said that every strong-willed Christian in the surrounding area took part in what they called the Great Purge of Fire. Hundreds gathered in the village, and they burned every single house down with people still trapped inside. If anyone had tried to escape from their burning homes, they had guns ready to shoot them dead. But there wasn't any shooting that night. Every single member of the Diaboli Locustarum burned inside their homes, peacefully. About 60 people died during the Great Purge of Fire. Men, women, children, the elderly, they all died that night. Interestingly enough, though, days after the fires had finally stopped, when the embers of their homes had died and the charred skin was cooled, some of the Christians returned to bury the souls that were lost. But when they got there, they discovered every burned victim had their eyes removed and their hearts taken right out of their scorched chests. That was the last time anyone would mention the Diaboli Locustarum publicly, and the last time there were any signs of the demon. There was a silence between the two, a real, tense silence. Richie was staring at his therapist, eyes widened, waiting for a response. But Dr. Miller was afraid to speak. The silence grew louder as time passed. Richie continued to sip from his flask, which broke the silence for a moment. But eventually the doctor began to say, "Richie, why are you telling me all this?" "Because I need you to understand something, doctor. It all connects, I promise. See, this house was built a few years ago when they expanded the city limits. It was prime real estate. They thought, the city's growing, might as well build new houses. But they forgot their history, Doc. They forgot about the darkness that still claims these parts. They built an entire neighborhood on top of the graves. Graves of Satanists." Dr. Miller still wasn't following. All he could focus on was the gun in his patient's hand. "I'm sorry, but please, enough of these riddles. Just tell me what's going on." The patient, who had been sitting on the edge of his recliner the entire time, sat back in his chair and took a deep breath before saying, "I didn't know my history either, Doc. My wife, my daughter, they didn't know either. How could they? When we moved in here, we thought this could be the start of our forever home. But we were very, very wrong." I'll pause here and leave you with the tension ratcheted up and holding on to the cliffhanger for part 2. What do you think Richie and Dr. Miller will do? Leave a comment or email me at redtreehousepod @gmail.com. A huge thank you to C.A. Serna for submitting this story for me to share. You can find his information, including his social media handles, in the show notes. As we turn down the lights on this episode, make plans to join me next time as I read part 2 of A Therapy Session by C.A. Serna. I'm your host, Will. Thanks for joining me in the Red Treehouse.